Hi, this is John Allen, the editor of Crux, an independent online Catholic news site. You can find us online at cruxnow.com. That is cruxnow.com. I am also a proud fellow at the Word on Fire Institute of Bishop Robert Barron. You can find all of their resources, their materials, much of Bishop Barron's output on their site, which is wordonfire.institute. Again, that is wordonfire.institute. Welcome to another episode of the John Allen Show, brought to you by the good people at Word on Fire. Now, in this week's episode, as always, we're going to break down the major Vatican, global church, and domestic church headlines of the last fortnight. Got three of them for you this time. We begin with the coronavirus, the biggest story in the world for the last 3 months. Italians are going back to Mass. That's the big headline here where I am, coming to you from my home in Rome, the Eternal City. Under the terms of a deal struck between the Italian Bishops' Conference and the government of Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte on the 7th of May, Italians will once again be able to attend daily Mass beginning on Monday, May 18th. And that means the first Sunday Mass that is going to be once again open to the public will be happening on May 24th, Sunday, May 24th. However, the Mass that Italians are going to be going back to is not quite the one that they were accustomed to going to before the coronavirus pandemic, because there are a number of conditions under which this permission has been given. 26 separate stipulations and 3 suggestions in the protocol that was signed between the government and the Bishops' Conference. So Mass is going to be a somewhat different experience once it starts up again. We will break all that down for you. One implication, by the way, of the church-state deal here in Italy is that Pope Francis has announced that he will stop live streaming his daily Mass from the Casa Santa Marta, that's the residence in the Vatican where he lives, which he has been doing since the lockdown was first imposed on March 8th. Although the Vatican did not say this out loud, presumably the idea is to not give people an excuse, basically, for not actually showing up at church, because his live stream Mass is readily available on YouTube and other media platforms. One of the things we are going to be tracking going forward is, as this gradual, what the Italians call ripresa, that is restarting or resumption, as this unfolds not only here in Italy but around the world, it will be interesting to see what becomes of all of those live stream liturgies that cropped up during the period of the quarantine. That many of them were phenomenally successful, and I would expect that there would be considerable interest in some quarters in seeing them continue. On the other hand, there will be the pastoral concern not to give people an excuse not to physically show up as a community for the celebration of the Eucharist and the other sacraments. So will be interesting to see what happens. On other fronts, the dominant news story here in Italy at the moment, and it's one with repercussions, really, for interfaith relations around the world, pivots on a 25-year-old volunteer in Africa by the name of Silvia Romano. She was serving for an NGO in Kenya when she was kidnapped by armed Islamic militants. They then, over a period of some months, moved her into Somalia, and she was held captive for about 18 months until a deal was finally struck for her release. Last Sunday, her plane from Somalia touched down at Rome's Ciampino airport. From that location, she made her way back to her home in Milan. Now, that sounds like the ultimate feel-good story, but it comes with a twist. One of the things Romano revealed in her conversations with officials of the Italian government at Ciampino is that during her captivity, she had been given a Quran in Italian and Arabic and began reading it. She also began conversing with one of her captors who spoke some English, as does she, and began talking about Islam. And in the end, she decided to convert. Now, she insists this was a free and spontaneous decision, despite the tendency in many quarters to assume that this had to have been done under some kind of pressure. And her profession of Islam has generated no small amount of controversy here in Italy, with some believing that the Italian government should not have engaged in such exerted efforts to bring back someone who, in their eyes, has essentially embraced the creed of terrorists, of radicals who target the West, places such as Italy, and of course, such as the United States. This has, of course, profound interfaith implications. The Italian church has waded in, really almost entirely on the side of giving the girl space, not making a federal case out of her religious identity right at the moment, because her head must be spinning from this experience, and she needs some time to figure out what the path forward may be. That, too, has generated some controversy, with critics here in Italy on the cultural right believing that the church is abdicating its responsibility to evangelize. That is, to make the point that one religion isn't just as good as another. And that debate is going on. We will break all that down for you. Finally, there is some news on the Vatican finance front. An internal economic analysis presented to Pope Francis and the heads of all Vatican departments recently indicated that the Vatican is in dire financial straits because of the coronavirus pandemic. Its annual deficit, is projected to balloon this year somewhere between 30 and 175%. There are expected to be severe shortfalls in the normal sources of income. And all that is inducing talk of accelerating the Pope's financial reform. We'll break down what the implications there might be as well. So those are the headlines this week. Stick around for the context.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
All right, so let's begin with the coronavirus, the Pope, and the Church. As we mentioned at the top of the show, Pope Francis has decided that he is going to discontinue streaming his daily Mass at the Casa Santa Marta beginning on May 19th. That's a Tuesday. Actually, he's not going to be doing it from the Santa Marta either on Monday, May 18th. He's going to be celebrating in St. Peter's for the anniversary of St. John Paul II's birth. And then as of the next day, he will, of course, continue to celebrate daily Mass, but it will no longer be live streamed. That is in response to the fact that on the 18th of May here in Italy, it will once again be possible for faithful to begin attending Mass in person. That is, the celebration of the public Mass has been authorized under the terms of a protocol signed by Cardinal Gualtiero Bassetti, President of the Italian Bishops' Conference, or CE, and Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte of Italy, along with Italy's Interior Minister. However, this Mass is going to be a somewhat different experience. For one thing, attendance is going to be limited. It is, under the terms of the protocol, it is up to every pastor in the country to decide what the maximum capacity of his church is in order to ensure that you can maintain 1.5 meters of distance between everyone inside the church at all times. To give you some sense of scale, there is a small oratory in the Campania down south in Italy, Our Lady of the Rosary. And video was recently uploaded from the parish showing them putting signs on all of the pews indicating where people could sit. Basically, two people will be permitted to sit in each pew. Now, this is a small oratory. It normally has a capacity of about 100 people or so. Under the social distancing requirements as part of this agreement, they're only going to be able to admit 32 people at a time, meaning they're only going to be able to have about a third of the people come to each liturgy that they normally would. Now, you might think that the obvious thing to do in such a set of circumstances would be simply to add more masses, so that if normally 3 masses on a Sunday were enough to accommodate the people who would show up, just make it 9, and that would solve the problem. Well, I mean, first of all, you don't have that many priests necessarily. The other problem is that also, under the terms of this agreement, churches have to be thoroughly cleaned before and after every use. There's a diocese up north, the Diocese of Belluno, where the bishop has said there has to be a minimum of a 2-hour turnaround time between each liturgy in order to make sure that the church can be thoroughly sanitized. Well, obviously, if you have to have a 2-hour buffer, eventually you run out of slots for masses. That means spaces in churches, to some extent, are going to have to be rationed. Some parishes here have begun either printing physical tickets that they will hand out to people who want to attend a particular liturgy. Others are doing this virtually. That is, they're asking people to go on the parish website to reserve a spot at a particular Mass. There's one priest here in Italy that has called on software developers to put together a new app for the Italian church that would allow people to reserve spots online. And if they can't get in to the parish of their choice, then they could, find the next closest one and see if they can get a spot there. The same priest, by the way, has also floated the idea of installing machines in front of churches that would basically be red light, green light. Green light would mean there's still a spot in church. You could approach the machine, push a button, get your ticket. Red light would mean, sorry, this Mass is full. You either have to wait for the next one or you have to go someplace else. Now, it remains to be seen how all this is going to play out, because in a way, it contradicts every instinct in a pastor's body to have a red light in front of his church. You want as many people as possible to come for the Lord's Supper, for the celebration of the Eucharist. However, the new normal is going to be not everybody can come. Once you get in, you are going to have to wear a mask, protective face mask, and gloves at all times. So will the priest, by the way. He's going to have to wear a mask and gloves during the celebration of the liturgy, and above all, during the distribution of communion. People are going to have to carefully line up, maintaining that 1.5-meter distance at all times. They will only be permitted to receive in the hand. The idea is to ensure that there never is any physical contact between the priest or the other celebrants. Obviously, the sign of peace will be eliminated. There will be no holy water in the entrance of churches where people would dip their fingers and then potentially spread infection. And so it is going to be a very different kind of experience. Also, the size of choirs will be significantly limited because, of course, pastors will want as many ordinary faithful to be able to come in as possible. There will be fewer servers. There will be fewer concelebrants. There may be limits on deacons assisting a priest at Mass, simply to make sure that, a spot that otherwise could have gone to a layperson, an ordinary member of the faithful, isn't eaten up that way. So, and it also remains to be seen how successfully every parish in this country is going to be able to comply with and monitor all of these protocols. There are 26,000 Catholic parishes in Italy. It is the largest number in the world. I mean, if you think about it, there are 11,000 Catholic parishes in Brazil, and there are 130 million Catholics there. So that's one parish for every 13,300 Catholics. In Italy, you've got one parish for every 2,000 Catholics. A lot of these are small chapels, oratories, tiny parishes, neighborhood places. They don't really have sophisticated, electronic protocols for regulating attendance. They don't necessarily have a parish staff that can stand outside and make sure only the right number of people come in. So the hiccups in all of this are something we're going to have to keep our eyes on. But in any event, point is, the Catholic Church, in Italy at least, on the 18th of May, is going back to business, but it is definitely not going to be business as usual. All right, the Silvia Romano story is very interesting. As I mentioned at the top of the show, she's now 25. She was younger. She was 23 when she volunteered for a non-governmental organization that did work among the poor in Africa. She was shipped off to Kenya, where she fell in love with the people, fell in love with the place, and by all accounts was just pouring herself out in service to people, serving in a rural village. One day, some armed men showed up asking for her. She wasn't around. She says now that she didn't think much of it. She thought it was just a kind of routine check. But a couple days later, when she was in the village, more men came back and they abducted her. They drove her out of the village in a Jeep very quickly. The Jeep broke down. They proceeded on foot for more than a month, arriving at some isolated compound where she was held for a while. She was moved again. She eventually ended up in Somalia. And while no one has officially said what the motive for the kidnapping was, it is widely believed here in Italy that this was basically a for-profit exercise, that it was a kidnapping for ransom, and that once a ransom was eventually paid, the Italian government, by the way, has denied any knowledge of public funds being used for a ransom. Not clear whether the family, private donors, somebody else might have been involved, but in any event, eventually Silvia Romano was liberated. When this news broke in Italy, you cannot imagine the national rejoicing that ensued here. People were thrilled. It felt as if someone who had been, presumed lost, maybe dead, had come back to life and was coming back to the country, coming back to her family. And obviously, amid the death and desolation of the coronavirus pandemic, this ray of light, this bolt of hope, was seized upon by everyone. Now, the national rejoicing, however, quickly took a more controversial turn because when Silvia Romano landed at Rome's Ciampino airport last Sunday, she was wearing traditional Islamic dress, that is, the gown, the head covering, and so on. And that gave everyone a moment of pause. And then, when she was led into the airport for a conversation with officials from Italy's Interior Ministry to talk about her experiences in captivity, she acknowledged that at one point, she said she had asked for a notebook to write in to keep a diary, and also for something to read. She said she was given a Quran in Italian and Arabic, so she read it in Italian, began thinking about it, at one point began discussing it with one of her captors who spoke English. So in English, they were talking about basic principles and tenets of Islam. And she says at one point she made the spontaneous and free decision to convert, to become a Muslim, and to take the name, by the way, Aisha. Now, she has insisted, both in her diary and in responses to government officials, that she was not compelled, that this was not a gunpoint conversion. Nevertheless, many commentators here in Italy believe there had to be some kind of pressure, some kind of stress. Some believe that she has a version of Stockholm syndrome where she came to identify and sympathize with her kidnappers, the people who were holding her hostage. In any event, this has generated a very active controversy, particularly online on social media, where some more culturally conservative voices here are saying that we shouldn't be rejoicing about the return of someone who has basically now identified herself with our enemies. The editor of a very prominent newspaper here said watching her land at Champino in Islamic dress was like watching a concentration camp victim return proudly dressed as a Nazi. Another very prominent politician, former candidate for prime minister, has suggested that if she genuinely has embraced Islam, she should be prosecuted as an enemy of the state. Now, these are extreme positions, of course, but in online discussions, some exceedingly cruel things have been said. So much so that Corriere della Sera, basically the New York Times of Italy, took the unprecedented step of shutting down the comments section on its website because it felt things were just getting out of control. Now, in that context, the Italian church has tried to be a voice of reason. Cardinal Bassetti, the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, gave an interview on Tuesday in which he said that we should all rejoice that Silvia is home. He said, in this moment, all of us feel as if she is our daughter. The pastor of her family's local parish in their Milan neighborhood has said that Silvia needs space, she needs time. Only she can answer the question of whether Islam is the right answer for her, and has rejected suggestions that he shouldn't be so welcoming, he shouldn't be so embracing, and so on. But that hasn't stopped a number of influential commentators from continuing to bang the drum. So far, at least as of this recording, the Vatican hasn't weighed in, although it's worth noting that all of this is happening on the eve of an ecumenical and interfaith prayer initiative amid the coronavirus, which involves both Muslims and Christians and Catholics, in which Pope Francis is participating. Obviously, it was not designed to send a signal on the Silvia Romano case, but that's how it's going to be read here, certainly. There are some here, again, mostly on the cultural and Catholic right, who believe that the church is abdicating its mission to evangelize, that it's promoting a kind of relativistic idea here, that it really doesn't matter what religion Silvia embraces as long as she's happy and at peace. And that one religion is as good as another. And they would like to see the church's leadership, if not condemning Silvia personally, at least taking a strong position that it would be better if she were to return to Catholicism. They would like to see someone say that out loud. Others believe that would be wildly inappropriate, that given the duress, the unimaginable circumstances Silvia has faced for the last 18 months, she should be left alone to make these decisions on her own. That debate is undoubtedly going to go on, and it, of course, is not simply an Italian debate, but it raises the question of what is the proper response of the church faced with someone who has made the decision to embrace another faith. And it's a tough one, because on the one hand, you certainly don't want to condemn the person, and until you've walked in their shoes, you can't understand the process that led them there. On the other hand, you don't want to sort of subtly, indirectly, or just through negligence, sign off on the idea that somehow everything is just the same, and that there is not some, if you'll pardon the expression, value added from being a follower, a disciple of Jesus Christ. And how to strike that balance is always extremely treacherous, and it is unfolding in real time here around the Silvia Romano case. And finally, Vatican finances. So, Pope Francis recently had a meeting with the heads of all departments in the Vatican. Technically, they're called dicasteries. So, these are the cardinals and archbishops who head all the major departments in the Vatican. And the subject matter of this meeting was largely money. And the message was we don't have very much of it. An internal analysis prepared by the Vatican Secretariat for the Economy sketched three scenarios for the financial impact of the coronavirus and then just the situation in the Vatican in general. Best case, middle case, worst case. The best case is that the Vatican's deficit this year will go up by about 30%. Worst case, it's 175%, which would translate into a deficit of 146 million euro, or about 158 million US dollars. Now, most observers looking at this are inclined to think that reality is likely to be closer to the worst case scenario, and that, in fact, it may actually be even worse than that scenario anticipates, because that scenario assumes that the Peter's Pence collection this year, which is going to take place on October 4th, will bring in enough money that the contribution from that fund, the annual contribution that fund makes to the Vatican, will not drop off very much. Some people believe that's wishful thinking, not merely because Catholics around the world simply are going to have less money to give, but also because of the association of Peter's Pence with the financial scandal that broke right before the coronavirus, which was this $225 million land deal in London that the Secretary of State got involved in to invest in some luxury apartments in the Chelsea neighborhood, using Peter's Pence, which, is marketed around the world as a chance for people to support papal charities. I doubt many Catholics who gave that money thought they were going to be buying a former Herod's warehouse to convert it into luxury apartments. And some people may decide, I don't want to give my money to something like that. So that's issue number one with these projections. Issue number two, they don't take into account the fact that at some point this year, the Vatican is going to have to face the next round of review by Moneyval. That's the Council of Europe's anti-money laundering issue. All indications are that the abrupt departure in November, under very murky circumstances, of the Vatican's anti-money laundering expert, Swiss lawyer René Brulhart, has rattled some windows at Moneyval and raised some very real questions. Should Moneyval elect, after this next round of review, to blacklist the Vatican, that is, to put it on a list of non-virtuous players, it could be frozen out of global financial markets. Its transaction costs could spike up significantly as people impose much greater due diligence costs. And if that's the case, then the Vatican shortfall could be actually worse than these projections entail. Now, there are two interesting points beyond just those dollars and cents numbers. Two interesting points in this analysis. One, it is recommended to the Pope that he direct all dicasteries, that is, all departments of the Vatican, to concentrate all of their liquid assets in the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See, or APSA, more or less the Vatican's central bank. First of all, APSA is the department in the Vatican that is in charge of payroll, that is, making sure employees are paid. And since about 50% of the Vatican's expenses every year go to cover payroll, the idea is to concentrate assets in the area of greatest immediate need. The other is so that those assets that are not needed for day-to-day operations can be pooled and invested, ideally, the idea being getting greater return than if each entity with a relatively small pocket of liquid assets were crafting their own investment strategies. The report recommends the creation of a centralized office to oversee those investments and to negotiate the best returns possible. Now, one interesting thing about that is that the idea of doing something like that originally came up from Cardinal George Pell back in 2014 when he was the Vatican Secretary for the Economy, obviously, before he had to leave that post to go home to Australia to face sexual abuse charges, for which Australia's Supreme Court eventually set aside those charges, vindicated Pell. But it is that idea of a centralized investment office kind of died on the vine here as Pell's star began to dim, but it is now apparently back. It will be interesting to see if it's acted upon, and more so, who's put in charge of it, and what kind of professional expertise they bring. A lot of people are skeptical about APSA being in charge of it. It has a reputation as not being particularly transparent and as over the years being somewhat scandal plagued. So it'll be interesting to see whether Pope Francis elects to bring in a sort of clean hands figure to take charge of that fund. The other issue is personnel, human resources. The report doesn't say this directly, but kind of elliptically refers to something that longtime Vatican observers have always known, which is the Vatican is overstaffed. It has a payroll it simply cannot support relative to its resources. Most people think its workforce has to be trimmed by about a third, because not only is the Vatican going broke trying to cover current payroll, but it is also every year assuming more and more unfunded pension liability that if something isn't done at some future stage, not too far down the line, is going to blow up in its face. And either there is going to be some kind of bankruptcy, or they're not going to be able to pay people's pensions, and they don't want to be in that position. So obviously, something has to give here. The report has suggested, among other things, investments in professional formation, because if the workforce is trimmed, the people who are left are going to have to be more productive, they're going to have to be more nimble, they're going to have to know how to work outside their own silo, performing tasks that are within their skill set for a variety of different departments to maximize a return on investment. Remains to be seen if that is going to happen, because remember, amid just at the cusp of this coronavirus thing, the Vatican one day announced the creation of a new human resources office to do precisely this kind of thing, and then the very next day announced that no, it actually hasn't been created, it's just an idea. The Pope is going to have to decide. So that question, which was put on hold, has been brought back with a vengeance by the financial realities of the coronavirus era. I think, two takeaways here are probably worth a wrap-up. One is that, up to this point, the debate over financial reform in the Vatican was sort of cast as a debate between reformers and the old guard, between whether business as usual is perfectly fine or whether we need to do something differently, either for moral reasons or for practical ones. That debate has not gone away, but the thing of it is, this is now no longer just an internal question, because the Vatican is now staring down the barrel of a $158 million gun. It simply cannot afford, and I don't mean that morally or evangelically, although those things may well be true, but I mean financially, it cannot afford to go on the way it has. So, reform is coming. Change is coming. The issue is what kind. And there we're going to have to wait and see. The other point, just worth making here at the end, is that whenever we talk about Vatican finances, I think it's important to just pause for a moment and focus on the actual dollar amounts we're talking about. Because, there is this myth about the Vatican out there that it is a financial colossus, that it's the wealthiest institution in the world, that it is opulent beyond imagination. And it's easy to understand where that comes from. I mean, you look at St. Peter's Basilica, that's not some prefab cheap construction. Or, you walk through the halls of the Secretary of State and you see these frescoes by Raphael, and it just takes your breath away, and you realize, that's got to be worth something. So you understand where the impressions come from. But the reality is, the Vatican's financial footprint is remarkably small by the standards of major institutions. I mean, look, the Vatican's annual operating budget is in the neighborhood of 200 million euro. Currency rates being what they are, that's what, 210, $215 million US. I'm not saying that's pocket change. But do you know what the annual budget at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana is? It's $1.3 billion, right? So the Vatican's annual deficit, even under the worst case scenario of $158 million, would be significant at a place like Notre Dame, but it would hardly bring the place grinding to a halt, which just goes to show you that both the virtues on the financial side of the Vatican and also its vices, its scandals, its meltdowns, its embarrassments, all of that is often terribly exaggerated relative to the amount of money in the real world we're actually talking about. The truth of it is somewhat miraculous that the Pope and his team manage somehow, on their better days anyway, to direct the affairs of a global church of 1.3 billion people on the incredibly modest means with which they are entrusted. All right, that's the John Allen Show for this week. Thanks for tuning in. 2 weeks from now, we will be back once again breaking down the big Vatican, global church, U.S. church headlines, all the latest and greatest from around the Catholic world. In the meantime, stay healthy, stay safe, keep reading Crux, cruxnow.com. Keep checking out the Word on Fire Institute, wordonfire.institute. Keep following Bishop Robert Barron online, and we will talk to you again soon.